Greg. So if anybody who might, the whole session will actually be conducted in English. So if you need interpretation, we also have sign language. So if you need help, we can actually provide the interpretation tool and so on. And without further ado, let me explain a little bit about this section. We have three speakers, very interesting, that during this tough time, they flew in from US and also from UK to actually come in to actually share with us. And it's a very interesting topic. We actually will cover a little bit more from the end. Every year we have this topic related to impact investment. This year we look into it from the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, where there's this, we were all mind-boggling with all these numbers that UN have defined, so that in 2030 we need to deliver, last I checked, with 5,300 KPIs to actually chase. So when we talk about investment today, we're looking into how do we measure it? How do we actually plan if the money is actually done right, or is the result is actually done right? And this year, interesting enough, we in the Nobel Economic Prize, not the Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Economic Prize, we actually have three members that actually wins it, and they actually come from the angle of using impact investment for elevating poverty. So it's actually very interesting. They use a method called random control trial, which actually is more or less building in the test of the impacts into the system. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But today, very interesting that we have a chance to actually come to actually discuss a little bit about different angle. We actually learn from other people how they actually work on it. Greg will actually be sharing a little bit with us on the American way, where he's from Rockefeller Finance Advisors, and then he will actually share a little bit about his angle, and then some of the more. He will talk a little bit about fintech also from the angle. So that's also just, since I'm a technology person, we can dig a little bit more into technologies and how innovation can actually help us in the process. And then Adam, coming in from UK, from Young Foundation, he will actually be sharing a little bit about, obviously, most of these social enterprise things start from UK. So how does that model work? And he will talk a little bit about our second topic, which is PPP, private-public policy integration and collaboration. And that's something I think it's really worth talking about and thinking a little bit about how the government or different policy can actually work together with the social enterprise world. And potentially also, I was talking to him a little bit about how some of these potential social enterprises in the UK, after almost 20 years, some of them are actually working on, some of them have already gone public and actually get funding from the public market to actually drive things and so on. So that's also a very interesting model. How do you scale up? How do you sustain beyond the first 2 years that you actually try out an idea? And how do you move things and so on? And I understand that his foundation also work on incubating newer ideas. So how would the startup model come into this new social startup model that we can actually share a little bit about? So that's an angle. And then we have Andre is a Hong Kong person, but he's now studying in the US. He's actually the founder of Future City Summit. So it's more looking into the future, how the newer technologies can enable us to actually build newer cities. And I would throw them a tough question about Hong Kong talking about this $1 trillion. I was checking out what's Yatman Ying, and then it actually is $1 trillion reserve. We only have $1 trillion reserve, so we are going to throw it into one bag to actually build an island. Maybe now you understand what's going on in the city more. So we want to bet on one city, and the city is going to be bigger than Kowloon. It's next to the airport, supposedly. And we'll talk a little bit about when we have a chance to build a whole new city. I don't know if that's passed already, but I don't know if we ever passed. But if it passed, if it decided to actually do it, if we are able to actually build a whole new city from what we have, how can we build it? How can we actually look into all these social things that we actually build in? How can we build a city without poverty, that gender it's equal, that good education is actually built in? That's the SDG stuff. So that's the background. So it will be interesting. So now, without further ado, I'll pass the time to Greg. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Let me tell you just a little bit about my firm, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. We were founded by the late John D. Rockefeller, And his approach was really to bring to philanthropy, charitable giving, a really firm business mindedness. And so it's not surprising that we end up in the impact investing space. We currently distribute about $200 million a year in grants and investment activity, and we work with over 150 clients. So I just want to define impact investing. I'm not sure how much people know and don't know about the space, but there's two major actors that you need to have in place. The first is the impact investor, which I represent, which is someone who brings to their investment activity not only the intention for financial return, but also the intention for social impact. And then you need a partner in that, which is a social enterprise of some sort that most importantly has a market-based approach to their work, so that there's a revenue stream that would allow the repayment of my investment funds. I think one of the things that we emphasize with our client base is that they think seriously about the theory of change that they're bringing to their investing activity. So you need to establish at the beginning the impact goals that you're intending to achieve, whether it's reducing poverty, developing housing, whatever it is. And then what is the financial return you need to pursue those goals? That really is what informs your theory of change in terms of your approach to the investing. And there's a wide range of activities, as I'll get into, that you can pursue as long as you're clear about that. So this is a spectrum of investing that we use in our work in the United States. On the far left is traditional investing. This is sort of the Wall Street, Hong Kong financial infrastructure that is looking to maximize profit above all else. And on the far right is traditional philanthropy, which is really giving away funds in order to improve social outcomes for particular regions, particular populations, whatever their focus is. And you can identify investment opportunities that go across this continuum that provide higher degrees of impact and social return, or lower degrees of financial return, whatever you prefer. So the key thing that we do in our work is that we really look at cross-sector collaboration. And on the left side, I look for all of my investment opportunities to work across the public, private, and nonprofit sector. So just to give you an example, in the United States, we have a very well-developed affordable housing development program where we often meet with a nonprofit organization that goes into an underserved, low-income community, and you may acquire abandoned apartment buildings that are not bankable. They then leverage government resources to begin to rehab those properties. And once the property is fully rehabbed, it's inhabitable by families, they will place the final mortgage with the banks in the US banking system. So that little triangle ensures that all the affordable housing is developed and financed in a sustainable way. The reason that's important is on the right side. So that little tiny dot, $400 billion in US philanthropy. It's a lot of money, but if you look at the federal government, which is $4 trillion, and the private US capital markets, which is $70 trillion, we're always looking to move from the nonprofit sector into the private capital markets because that's where the real money is. And if you really want to think about scale and sustainability, understanding how to navigate across sectors and into the mainstream markets is what's going to produce the best outcomes, we think, for society. So now I just want to talk a little bit about a few projects. And you know, we're all here talking about the SDGs, and that there is this 3.9 million need. There's about 1.4 that is currently spent, and the 2.5 represents the gap. The good news about impact investors is that more than half to 2/3 of them really align their work behind the SDGs. So they can bring some significant capital to beginning to close this gap. Just as an aside, RPA has worked with the UN and a number of other partners to develop the SDG philanthropy platform, which is a resource that you can all go to that has not only information about transactions, but also opportunities to meet like-minded investors and partners in the work. So I want to take you through two examples that really focus on financial inclusion. And the World Bank has said that there are more than 2 billion people that do not have access to financial services. And these are basic financial services like savings, access to credit, insurance, those kinds of things. Yet we know that with access to those financial services, you can reduce poverty, you can promote economic growth and development, and you can create more sustainable, viable cities and communities. And so we envisioned a future where all individuals would be connected to different digital platforms that would allow those transactions and those products and services to take place. So the first example I want to talk to, and I want to really reinforce this notion of this continuum, is much more on the Wall Street side of the aisle. It is a private equity venture investment opportunity that is in a company called ModusBox. And ModusBox is a digital payment clearinghouse. They have two components to their product. The first one is Mojaloop, which is basically a network of financial clearing activities, and Pordex, which allows any individual financial service provider to connect into that network and have their transactions cleared across multiple providers. So we've been working with them in the country of Tanzania, and this is where the PPP part comes in, to bring together the Central Bank of Tanzania, the leading mobile phone provider in the country, to develop a mobile payment system that would be the first of its kind in the sense that it is nationwide. And so the partnership across those three sectors is really critical, both in terms of getting the breadth of service coverage that we hope to see, as well as the functionality in the system. And so right now we've got more than 50 banks that are participating. We have all of the mobile phone providers that are participating, and more than 60 sort of digital currency operators that are sort of both nonprofit and for-profit players. ModusBox is now in the process of raising another $20 million to fuel its expansion with us into Nigeria and to other countries. And so this is a real investment opportunity that is live right now. So now I want to go to the other end of the spectrum, still in financial inclusion, still in fintech, but this is fully grant funded as opposed to private equity funded. So the Catalyst Fund is $25 million that is raised, contributed by JP Morgan Chase. And it is going to fintech companies that are providing services to underserved companies, communities, and leveraging technology to both lower the cost and expand the range of service delivery. And their focus is really getting companies through what we call the valley of death, where they have a product or a prototype, but they haven't yet figured out the product market fit, and so they don't have consistent revenues that can actually drive profitability and growth going forward. They have a very select set of criteria to make sure that the companies that they're investing in are serving the underserved communities and populations that they care about. And it's really on the grant side, not only because of the phase of the investment cycle that they are focused on, but also the riskiness of the companies that they are investing in and the populations, as we often view low-income populations as being high-risk populations to serve. So they've invested in 25 companies in their first round, and they are getting ready to launch a second round where they hope to invest in another 30 startups. So let me just close with some sort of takeaways, both in terms of thinking about the cross-sector connection, and how you need to really think through your theory of change and how you're going to merge your financial and social objectives into an effective investment opportunity, that the full spectrum is there, that you don't have to think about maximizing profit or maximizing charitability. You can do it all, and you can do it all in different and very creative ways. And that it's so important to engage partners across all sectors to ensure that there's scale and sustainability. The other piece is thinking about the ecosystem within which your projects are operating. So what I loved about the Catalyst Fund idea is that they're very early stage venture capital that could eventually go to the other end of the spectrum. And those ecosystem investments are really important. They also add sort of incubator type support for the companies at the low end of their market that would allow them a higher probability of success that's contributing to the overall environment for entrepreneurs in the space. And then the last piece is make sure that you collect data and stories that will not only allow you to tell your story, but also begin to contribute to the evidence base of effectiveness in the space. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Adam.
Actually, it's maybe we do a quick Q&A because there are some things that's very, very interesting that people might be interested. I'm very interested in both of the cases. I think we can open up a little bit if anybody have anything that might want to bring out. I think both are very interesting cases. Okay, can we have the mic in the back? Please speak a little bit about who you are and then what's the question about. Please. Oh, sorry. It's okay. Why don't you speak up?
Okay. Hi everyone. Ryan from New World Development. Basically, my question is more on how exactly is the difference between the traditional financiers in terms of their way of thinking compared to like impact investors. When they're identifying opportunities, are their methodologies fundamentally different, or how they reconcile these differences if they are?
No, that's a great question, and it's a constant source of debate in the space. So I think that all impact investors are looking to make sure that the business is a viable business and that it has a sound business model. So you still are looking for a real business opportunity. And then the second lens is really making sure that with that business opportunity, they're reaching out to populations that might not be able to access the goods and services of the company. And so the most impact investors are not opposed to serving mainstream communities. So if you think about it, a national digital payment system, wealthy people are probably going to use that as much as poor people. You just want to see an emphasis within the enterprise for reaching out more deliberately to the underserved parts of the community. But that's a great question.
Do they distinguish, I mean, for the impact investor, do they, let's say for the Modus project, Modus process, project, let's say, are they focusing only on the poor, or this is actually a national system, but with a mission to actually help the poor?
So it's a national system with a focus on the poor. And what we find in impact investing is that if you can develop a product that really benefits the underserved or low-income populations, it benefits everyone.
And it actually helps to pay back the whole process. It's a way of portfolio.
Yes.
It actually helps them to look very good.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else? Otherwise, we'll have in the back. Okay, yeah.
Are there cases where it's not a fintech solution that's in impact investing?
Yes, oh yeah, definitely. There, and I think that Adam is going to speak a little bit more about that. But we work in education technology in terms of a lot of technology stuff. And the real issue around technology is that it can make service delivery to customers with limited ability to pay more cost effective. And so technology you'll hear a lot about in these things because of that. But it doesn't always have to be technology either. I mean, what the affordable housing piece that I was talking about is considered an impact investment. It's similar to what would be a fixed income investment, usually returning in the sort of 4 to 7% range. Well, now it's probably lower given interest rates. But there are a whole range of investment opportunities.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you very much, Greg. Okay, maybe Adam can actually develop for this. Yeah. It's good, very good.
Great, thank you. Okay, anyway, I'll start. It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you very much for the invitation. So I work for an organisation called the Young Foundation, which is a think tank and a social investor. So we try and understand society's problems, and we try and come up with some investable solutions. So my team, we run accelerator programs and incubators for early stage startups, and then the best of those we invest in. We try to support them over the long term to grow and develop. And we invest in a range of things, mainly education, but as Greg was talking about, sort of educational technology, but through to mentoring programs and different kinds of models. We also invest in charities, social enterprises, and corporate businesses. So we really try and think across the range of corporate forms to drive the most social impact. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about public-private partnerships. Really I was trying to think why do you do, or why are these interesting ideas? Why do people think about these in the first place? What is it about them that is interesting and good? And I guess there's probably a couple of reasons, really. And you're looking for things that the public sector can't do alone, or doesn't want to do alone. Why wouldn't they want to do alone? Well, they want a partner, and that partner needs to bring something. A partner can bring capital, a different form of capital, a different kind of risk-taking capital, or they can bring ideas, so they bring in different ways of doing things, and different models and approaches, and perhaps different culture and execution methods. So it's really, as we're going through this, thinking, why would you do a public-private partnership? You know, it's got to be about bringing something additional to public services and to social services that the government can't do alone, and that needs to do in partnership. So I thought I'd do a little history lesson on public-private partnerships in the UK. So, does everyone know who this guy is? Yeah, Tony? So this is in 1997, when he was elected, on a wave of kind of euphoria and excitement, and he came in with a bunch of different ideas, and one of them was about the relationship with the private sector. Actually the key thing, one of the key things Labour wanted to do, it was very famous, a lot of his campaigns, he was asked, on one of his campaign speeches, he said, what are your 3 priorities? And he said, education, education, education. So he was, and it really stuck. And really that was coming after 20 years of underinvestment in particularly the infrastructure in education and in health. So we had crumbling hospitals and schools so I went to school around this time, and my classroom, when it rained, it just came through the ceiling, and when it was windy, it came through the wall. So luckily it was a geography class. So we studied physical geography a lot. So we got to feel, real geography.
Which city? Which city?
This was near Liverpool. So one of the more underserved parts of the UK. So really that priority was, let's redevelop the public infrastructure and let's build better public infrastructure. But they had a couple of other priorities too. They didn't want to add huge amounts of public debt. They didn't want to borrow lots of money to do this, and they wanted to work differently with the private sector. And I think they believed that the private sector would be quicker and do this more efficiently and get things done. So they started on a program of public-private partnerships called Private Finance Initiative. And that led to the construction of many, many big new hospitals. So my next slide. Yeah, this is the hospital. I was born in the hospital that was knocked down, and this was built in its place. So this was the replacement. Huge thing, hundreds of millions of pounds, built very quickly, and within a few years, lots and lots of new public infrastructure that was changing how public services were delivered. And that was a very positive thing for public services at that point. You see, this is the growth of PPPs during the period of government that I'm talking about. So in the late 90s, you had about £1 billion worth of capital investment, and about 10 projects. By early 2000s, that was about 60 projects and about £6 or £7 billion worth of investment. And the way these worked, the government put a contract out and said, we want you to, private sector, to design, to build, maintain and operate this hospital for us. We'll provide the staffing, we'll provide the technical expertise, but you provide the infrastructure and the operations, so the cleaning and the kind of facilities management, we would call it. And the way we will pay for this, you pay for the development and the building, and we'll pay you an amount every year for the next 30, 40 years, so that you can repay for that initial upfront cost. And private sector, you're taking the risk. So you're building it, you're developing it, you take the risk, we'll pay in increments. And obviously, for a new government without much money, who didn't want to raise tax, this was a great approach. Lots of money in, lots of capital development. However, there were a number of questions about this. So PFI deals costing taxpayers billions. So this was so the BBC News article on the top left. Very common story, and that was in 2018, right? So we're still, even 10, 20 years later, people are talking really about the cost of this. Was it worth it? Was it good value for money? And there's billions of pounds being spent out to repay this investment. Questions about the risk reward. So was the private sector is making a good reward, but did it take enough risk? Is it appropriate for it to get that much profit from the risk it took? And actually, if you think about it, a government contract for 30 years to repay in full, that isn't the most risky thing you can do. I work with a lot more risky investments. So it's kind of, there are a lot of questions about whether in those early contracts that was appropriate. Contracts were often inflexible. So public health changes. So 10 years after one hospital was built, it wasn't needed anymore. But to close it would have cost more money than to keep it open because of the problems with some of the contracting and the inflexibility. And yeah, complex contracting. These contracts were this thick. The private sector often had access to more capacity for lawyers and better paid lawyers, and they could put in kind of little clauses and little protections, and actually 10 years later when the public sector needed to change something, it was very expensive and very difficult. And limited social value focus. So a lot of these contracts were very finance focused and very operationally focused. Actually, we weren't thinking, in terms of thinking about the SDGs, there weren't many KPIs around what are the outcomes, how is this improving health, how are we, and that meant that the operator wasn't always aligned with government to say how do we make the best healthcare system we can, how do we make the best education outcomes we can. Actually, you had a misalignment of their values. So I think the consequence was that this is a very controversial thing in the United Kingdom, and these models from this period are controversial. They did get huge amounts of new infrastructure built quickly, which was a real positive, but now people are looking at these and saying, actually, some of these deals were great, some of them weren't, and how do we learn from this and do public-private partnerships in a different way? So I want to talk quickly about some different models of public-private partnerships that I've been involved in over the past couple of years. So I'll talk first about social impact bonds. So I don't know, can I have a show of hands who's heard of a social impact bond? That's a few, that's good, that's good. I will attempt to explain it in about 30 seconds, which always fails, however I will try. So this is where government says, I will pay for an outcome. Instead of paying for an activity or an input, I want to pay for an outcome. So for example, in homelessness, I will pay when you house a homeless person, I'll pay when you sustain that homeless person in housing for 6, 12, 18 months, and I'll pay when you get that homeless person into work. That is different from traditional contracting, where they say, I will pay you to build a hostel and to operate that hostel. So this is trying to say we're going to pay for the social outcomes, not the inputs and the activities. And this is an example here on the left of a rate card, which is the price against each of those things. So we'll pay £1,500 if you get someone in accommodation for 3 months. We'll pay £3,000 for 13 weeks full-time employment. Sorry, it's a bit small, but you get the point. And it's a good way of illustrating really trying to pay for outcomes. The challenge with paying for outcomes from a provider perspective is that you need to pay for the service first. So you need to deliver, you need to set up the service, you need to deliver services to people, and eventually you'll get the outcomes. So for the in-work outcome, that might be after 2 years of working with someone. It might take a long, long time to get to that point. So you need to finance the upfront costs of delivery in a different way. And this is where you get the public-private partnership. So a social investor can come in and provide that capital to the partner, to the provider, so they can deliver the service, and then when they get the outcome, they can repay the social investor. So this is a different model, three-way partnership: government, social provider, and social investor. And yeah, paid on outcomes. And I guess how is this different from some of the previous models? Well, the risk reward is much clearer here. If the outcomes are not achieved, the provider and the social investor doesn't get paid. So there's a real risk taking, and that drives different behaviours. Also, these are about outcomes. So the focus is really, really on what's the social value you're creating, and how are you driving that differently. So there's also in social impact bonds now in the United Kingdom, to the point I was making earlier about contracts, we have template contracts. So we have a contract that all government will use for commissioning these things, and that's the same for everyone. Now maybe you want to tailor it and change it, but that means that the problems of contracting and clauses and penalties is much less than perhaps in some of the early PPPs. So I do have a couple of other examples, but I think I'm taking too long. My history lesson on Tony Blair went on too long, so I apologise for that. But just in terms of some of the reflections for how we get PPPs right, particularly as we're thinking about SDGs and how we get investment into those SDGs. So firstly, thinking about the risk reward and the incentives of the different partners. How do you align partners around the same incentives? How do you really think through the risk that government's taking, the risk the private sector's taking, the risk the social partner's taking? How do you think that through and get the balance right? Secondly, the social value. How are you measuring, capturing and articulating the social value? And then how do you put that into a contract? How do you make the return and the rewards for good performance dependent on achieving some of those social outcomes? And that's easier said than done, and this is a new field, but the UN, along with the SDGs, are thinking a lot about how can you measure this? How can you articulate it? How can you put KPIs down so that actually when we are developing new construction and new housing and new education, we are also thinking about how we achieve the social outcome. And finally, the partnering and the politics. Which companies are you partnering with? What's your relationships? Are you sharing the same vision and mission? If you're not, you risk getting bad politics. And that's really what I think some of the early PPPs suffered from in the UK, perception-wise, is that these are organisations not aligned to society's needs and government needs, and that really hits the political implications of it. So thank you very much. That's a short lesson on PPP in the UK, but hopefully entertaining. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quick questions. How's the result? Because I saw the old PPP, PFI or PFI, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's basically gone. Now you have the impact bonds. It's still new, but how's the initial results?
For social impact bonds?
Yeah.
So social impact bonds, they're very small at the moment, so far, but they're growing in interest and growing in excitement. I think that the PFI has died at the moment, and particularly because the cost of government borrowing is so low at the moment. So actually it's cheaper for government to construct some of the infrastructure itself. But yeah, social impact bonds are growing and are interesting, but I think in the UK at the moment we have other priorities.
Okay.
We should be thinking about this, but we spent 3 years thinking about something else.
And changed PM quite a few times through the process. So no long-term thing.
Exactly.
Okay. We'll come back to those. Anything about this thing that anybody want to raise? Yeah, please.
And from like in incubator sort of point of view, how do you prioritize which sort of social issues do you address first? Like for instance, in the UK, what are the key priorities that the government or private sector is actually focused on?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Sorry. That's a really interesting question. I think, as I say, actually, society's been quite distracted by other things for quite a long time. But the key area is probably, so education is always a priority, and a lot of our work is in education. But the other area that's really grown a lot in the last decade is housing and homelessness. So homelessness has increased 300% over the past decade, or even more on recent numbers. That's people sleeping on the streets. Actually, people in unstable homelessness has increased even more. I think 100,000 families live in temporary accommodation, 200,000-300,000 children. It's a big problem. So there's a lot of effort to try and find different solutions around housing. And I guess what's interesting from a PPP and a social investor perspective is that that's an area that needs a lot of money and a lot of investment. And there are lots of different models you can use for accommodating people. That's probably one of the key other areas. But cutting across all of that is the use of technology. So how are we using technology to understand social issues better and offer some responses? So yeah, education definitely, housing definitely, but how are we using technology better as a society to solve some of those problems?
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
James Lam from CUHK, my training foundation. And talking about PPP, for actually referring to the private sector and the public sector within the government. Nowadays, some people are talking about cloud economy, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, that kind of things. Do you think that apart from the private sector, apart from the government sector, the people on the street, the general public, could also contribute to that kind of social financings, like through crowdsourcing or crowdfunding strategy?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's one thing. I also think it's not, the term is PPP, but I think that's not very helpful. Actually, most of the recent PPPs we've seen are social enterprises or social businesses. So it's a bit broader than just private sector and public sector. But yeah, I think there's also a role, and there's some interesting models around crowdsourcing for, I was talking to someone yesterday who was talking about crowdsourcing for initial construction and development of new facilities in communities that's then repaid by government. So I think there are really interesting models. I don't think we've got much of that in the UK, but I think that's definitely an interesting area to explore. Yeah.
Definitely, I think crowdsourcing and also all kinds of new model. I think when you're talking about the UK and the European situation also, I think that our next speaker will actually talk a little bit more about, he's actually related to a topic that's the Belt and Road project, which the China government is going to pay for all your country stuff, supposedly. So that's also something worth looking into, because there are funding coming in to actually do it. All for the last 20 years or 10 years, the QE is actually paying off a lot of the jobs. So that's actually drive the interest rate around. In a way, it's all business. It's all how things are being paid back, but also how do you measure it over time? Because how would you know how much is the cost of an NHS bed in 10 years? And those are things that's very, very difficult, especially when you tie it with a complex model with interest rates and so on, not a simple mortgage, I think. In the last 2 years, Hong Kong, we negotiate our electricity contract with the two monopoly that we formed 60 years ago. At that point in time, we all understand PPP in the sense of nobody is going to invest into all these electricity infrastructure type work. But then we give them a monopoly for 30 years, so they'll be able to actually pay that back and so on. But the new contract that they negotiate, if I remember right, guaranteed them 8.9% return for the next 50 years. Wow. Well, so that's also coming back into other factors, including who you are paying with. Because why are you giving us such a big contract, guaranteed return with all these things and so on? Or why are you giving all this money to actually build that port in Pakistan? All these things are related because the whole world is actually changing. And all these factors come in. I think PPP also, it's in a way policy, but crowdsourcing also bring in that people need to say people themselves. So somehow we see problem in the environment. But obviously social enterprise, social entrepreneurship needs to come in. Because if you don't sustain money-wise, you don't sustain, simple. But how do we actually start with some different investment? Different investor needs to be paid back, either with numbers in impact or also in money. So I think all those are tough questions that we're going into. Okay, I'll pass it to Andre for the next thing. You don't have slides, right? So should I just give you a mic? Yeah? Do you want to start? Yeah. Okay. Let's give Andre a good hand.
That's cool. So I actually had a slide, but I think the past, actually Dr. Lam invited me to be here already very long ago. So I had a slide, but I think given the scenarios right now in Hong Kong, I would rather provide more spontaneous speech and sharing about Hong Kong. And from a young people perspective, it's nothing political, but I think from an entrepreneur perspective, who are also studying public policy right now in Singapore, there's something very interesting that I found, and I think the following share is highly related to designing for happiness. So 1 year ago, I received one year ago, I was still in the final year students in HKU, and then that was the time I was still struggling because I almost couldn't graduate as an entrepreneur. And then a year after, then I received a letter that I was invited and also potentially providing a grant from Lee Ka-shing Foundation. So I was like, ooh, in a 1 year time, I was suddenly invited to be a Lee Ka-shing scholar on public policy. So it's something very interesting. Like Irvin said, the world is changing so fast. How come, I didn't expect that I would be a student on public policy, and how come school in Singapore will invite me to study about public policy? But turned out when the school explained to me, they said they would like to bring entrepreneurs back to campus and understand how entrepreneurs think, especially entrepreneurs think about the world and how they think about the world that the policy schools should learn. So I think that's one of the very major agenda when we design policy. I've been studying policy right now. When we in the graduate school, the young leaders, the young entrepreneurs, when we're studying public policy, we have a cycle to design policy. And that involves how we spend resources from the public and design the policy that drives the public-private partnership, which is agenda setting. And the agenda setting is really important, and also the agenda setting basically set forth how the city and also how this public will look like in 10 years. So I think that's the beginning of my sharing. I would like to echo a little bit on the designing for happiness, and also this very interesting topic, and also how good finance and also how PPP will be looked at from the young people's perspective. So as an entrepreneur, the happiness is, the term happiness for young people is something very simple that when I was being an entrepreneur, all my parents have been teaching me about is how you become an honest person, and also how you become a diligent, and also how you become as a person, because my parents are from very grassroots background. The soft elements, the characteristic, how you look at the social issues drive you to be a social entrepreneur. So the way we see the world is so much different from how simply we look at the public-private partnership, because the upside agenda of the public-private partnership is always so much about finance, but then turn out our social entrepreneur is more related to looking at the grassroots level, social issues, and so on. So, sorry, I'm very nervous to share.
It's okay.
So I think that one issue that so while I'm also studying public policy, what we're doing in Hong Kong right now is sorry, I can't share. I think I will just skip my presentation and I will just go to the panel discussion directly.
Okay.
Sorry, everyone.
That's okay, but you can share a little bit about your story. How do you see as a young person? How do you see this potential discussion? Where is it leading us? Not in the street, but here, but also, then into the street, then into beyond Hong Kong, because everybody is in turmoil. I mean, impeaching a
US is
president.
out of lockdown.
No, they are. No, only you see more. So everybody is in trouble. And social, it's beyond just poverty. It's beyond the 70 SDG. I mean, we're joking. How about toxicity? How about 2,000 tear gas on the same day in a small spot? All these are social problems that normal social entrepreneurs don't really talk. But this is something that the whole world is going through. When people argue this is the liberal Democrat swinging back to the other world, but it's a history. But again, as a person, maybe we can share a little bit. I mean, we are not here, we all want to learn from each other. And then that feeling from global point of view and also local point of view, and from a student point of view also is also very important. Maybe just share it from your heart. Storytelling is the most important thing. That's the best KPI that we can have.
Yes, since I was invited to share here, I've been struggling so much what I should really be sharing, because what we are doing in Future City Summit is we drive a huge agenda on development. My beginning of entrepreneurship journey started from Cambodia back in 2012, and the way I started this journey is simply because we lost. As a young people, I studied HKCE, the last batch of HKCE with Hao and Go Hao. Basically, if you fail to get to that particular course or degree, those young people lost their goals, and I'm one of them. So I was trying to be a doctor, and turned out my A level is not good enough, and I go to HKU, and then the biggest problem is what I'm doing there in school, and so I happened to get a chance to volunteer in Cambodia, and that's why I begin. That's the starting point. I look at social issues. The previous two speakers, Brad and Adam, shared a lot about KPI metrics, the way we high-level thinking of PPP. But as young people, I think the young generation don't look at the things that way. We look at a more bottom-up approach. When we go to the local area, if you simply go to rural area in Cambodia, in Siem Reap, the way you talk to the people there is simply so simple that you don't talk about matrix. You don't talk about, oh, what is your ROI, if I give you $100, what do you give me back? There's no such conversation. The way is so sentimental and also so emotional that, okay, I simply want to do something, create value, not just helping, because we are also learning in the process, but learning what's going on with them and how their destiny is actually tied to our destiny. I think that's the echoing back to what I'm talking about. The policy design is all about agenda setting, because when we talk about designing for happiness, it's not simply about we give something to another party and solve the issue done. The dynamics and also the way we design is so much different, so much related to how we create value together. And that part set forth the creation of happiness, and that set forth the destiny of Hong Kong. And that's why Hong Kong is so special in regarding PPP, which is actually so little mentioned in our class. I major international relations, I study politics in Hong Kong, HKU. We zero mention PPP, and zero mention why Hong Kong is important in international relations. Maybe a little bit like Dr. Simon Shen mentioned a bit Hong Kong identity in a global world, but then I think the more important is how young people perceive the mission of setting a gender in connecting, again, the developing world, and also connecting our professional knowledge. So going back, that's the mission of Future City Summit. And so we started this work in 2016, and starting from this year, we also start a small impact fund in Indonesia on affordable housing and education technology as well. So I think all along that the work that we have been doing has been very rewarding to us, and also that remind us a lot why we are doing all this. And so yeah, it's pretty much. I will just leave here for now. Thank you.
Let's give it a good hand. Well, a difficult session. I also had this problem when I was stuck in the traffic this morning for 2 hours and trying to think, why are we coming here? Are we talking about all academic stuff? But no, it's all about human stuff, and it's all about and social. It's actually the whole thing, and it's. I think we obviously we can depends on how it's going. I throw out a few questions and then see how it goes. But I think what Andre has started is actually quite interesting, and coinciding in one of the questions about crowdsourcing, because it's the people care about people. And at the end, obviously, that might come down to a policy that actually drive things to actually happen. But if we push it even more, if we actually see social enterprise as social entrepreneurial model, it's actually the basic model of actually running a business where you actually focus on delivering, but not just on profit, but also on delivering social impact at the same time, double bottom lines. And if we think about it that way, it's actually built into the system. That obviously we can push one of the spectrum to the CSR type thing. I earn money, I pay for carbon, something like that. That's the worst case I can think about. But I'm an asshole, but I pay for carbon, so it's okay. So something like that. But on the other hand, there might be a lot of projects that actually a new bank that's only basically focused on helping the poor. But I don't mind serving everybody because I will have efficiency to actually drive it. So newer technology likely, because this new old model usually it's being controlled in most economy by incumbents, large companies, large political parties, and so on. But newer model, all these sharing economy type thing, all the new banking 4.0, all these new fintech type stuff, or crowdsourcing, all these things are new things that we can use, or new technology that enable us to actually form platforms like an Airbnb, that might actually help a lot of poor people, that they can rent out a room that's sitting there. That might be useful for some of the countries that I went to. All these are new models that we actually see. How do you see, for back to the panel, how do you see newer technology potentially enabling us to actually deliver value? Also potentially beyond government. Because I think government, it's going, UK government might be with major change, Hong Kong government, I don't know. But the US government may be potentially major change. So how do we see this entrepreneurship and or social entrepreneurs saving the world in a way? Yeah.
I think they will be the salvation of our future.
Ah.
And I think that so many of the tensions today arise out of economic issues. And we may think of them as social issues, but they're often fought because of access to economic issues, whether it's Brexit or whatever. I mean, all of those conversations, even in the US and President Trump, it's about access to a living wage and employment opportunities that allow you to support your family and contribute to your community. So many of the issues that we are willing to go to the streets for are really about economic and finance. And I think if you can combine finance and social issues, you can solve so many more of the world's problems. And so a lot of the business models that we're looking at are those that are often led by a social impulse, whether it's financial inclusion and bringing more poor people into the financial system, knowing that access to those services will improve the smoothness of their life in a lot of ways, for lack of a better word, and more importantly, pull them into the mainstream financial systems that allow them to contribute back to their communities in ways that are very meaningful to themselves. And so I think that a lot of what we're after can be solved through these approaches.
In a way, the investor, it's the seed. They actually invest, they start the process and push the van, and the van go, and the van would actually run itself. And that, okay.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that, and I think particularly in some of the investments we make, the ability of technology to help social enterprises listen and social businesses really listen and understand consumer behavior is really important, because once you understand that, you can build products and services that really respond to need. And if you don't do that with a social impulse, you may get people being excluded from the financial system even further. So I think it's really, really important that we harness that technology with the right impulse and right understanding to be able to expand and build a more inclusive economy. I also think, particularly from the investor perspective, just because you mentioned that, we've seen a couple of examples of quite social businesses that have become non-social over time because the investors are driving certain behaviours and actually that group's not quite as profitable. So let's focus elsewhere. So I think there's a really important role for socially minded investors to say, actually, we value that, and we think it's important that you keep that as part of your core mission. So yeah, I think that's, and I've seen that particularly in technology.
Very good point. I think that might bring in the B Corp and the argument where putting it onto paper into the shareholder agreement or the articles will actually help.
Yeah, absolutely, and just sort of basic reporting. Who are you working with? What are the demographics? Even being able to sort of really clearly say these are who we're working with and how it aligns to that mission. Simple stuff, not easy to do, but simple structural stuff that you can write into articles. I think that can be really powerful. And
tie that to auditing. So
ideally,
yeah,
a few years hence, absolutely.
Then transparency comes in, and then you invest into, you buy things. Fair trade, it's actually in the whole system itself. Spending so much money just to check the numbers. Yeah. If it's actually built into the system, when we fund it, we can drive the seed so that it's actually put into the paper. They can change it over time, but at least it's a democratic process for the board or the shareholder to actually decide to actually change. And then when they leverage too much on the public money, public in the sense of public IPO type money, then they might actually change the route. But that's also interesting because in Hong Kong we have the MTR, which used to be a government thing, but now it's only 20% public. But the government keep on telling us they don't have any control. They only have 80% control, but they don't have any control because of the shareholder interest. These are very strange arguments, but that's also very important. Where how do we finance the process actually, or how do we drive the incentive to actually drive the whole matter? Yeah.
So I have an interesting example of a project. To your point about is there anything besides fintech, right? It's a healthcare example where an organization called IDRI, which is the Infectious Disease Research Institute. So they do a lot of research into infectious diseases, and they are the creators of the shingles vaccine, which is in the US on TV all the time. Anyway, they licensed the IP, intellectual property, to GlaxoSmithKline, who took all of that and started to distribute it in the US. What they realized after the transaction is that they gave away the rights to distribute that in the developing world where similar infectious diseases persist, but that there's no financial incentive for GSK to distribute the vaccine in those countries. So they came to us because they wanted an impact investor to invest and put constraints on the future use of the intellectual property so that they could retain the rights to distribute whatever future inventions they have in a developing country context. And so they wanted the partnership of commercializing the healthcare IP with the GSK, but they wanted to retain the rights for distribution in a way that would bring the benefits to a much more developing country.
Who did the research in this case, or original?
So we did along with the venture capitalist, and the venture capitalist was very committed with IDRI to making sure that happens. And they've got a list of patents and copyrights and things on different drugs. So they're a very successful track record, but they want to do more good in the future. And so these kinds of structures, I think, are going to become more and more common.
Yes, I think this will also bring in intellectual property, which in the university we will actually think a lot about this. The last 20 years we have been pushing them to actually capitalize on knowledge transfer and start making a startup, but then it will all go the Google way,
Right.
which now it's usually ego related. But then in a lot of this research, obviously pharmaceutical is a little bit different because the pharmaceutical company in a way control everything. But a lot of the research for new IP comes from universities. And these likely when it's funded by the public funding anyway. And then can we actually create the IP so that part of that it's always used at a low cost to actually help healthcare, education, and some very clearly defined infrastructure thing in the future. I think all those are very important points. Anything, Andre, you want to add?
Well, regarding IP technology, I think technically I'm not in that field, but I think I would jump in additional point on this field, which is the participation of young entrepreneurs in PPP as a whole, especially on technology. So public-private partnership, especially in emerging countries like Southeast Asia, is still very government driven, and you know the Southeast Asian government is still dominated by a lot of seniors. Start getting phenomenon that the mayors and also the politicians are young people right now. Like we work with one mayor who are 22 years old. Become the mayor right after he graduated from school. He was also one of us like me. but then the thing is how young leaders can also become part of the agenda and also become part of the journey of development agenda is one thing. Another is how young perspective bring along intellectual properties and technologies into the public-private partnership is another thing. So I think that's my 2 cents here on the comment.
That brings in another interesting point where in developing countries, the obviously usually they have a very strong government, and then they might get funding from UN or World Bank, and they might have their own funding to actually drive things. But how do that communication with the newer generation comes in? Because all the I agree we need digital natives who are less than at least from the 80s or the 90s to actually at least communicate well how things are working. They are not just part of the team that you actually listen to and that's it. You want them to actually have drive a little bit on the matter because the value is different. The way they live is different, and then they live in a completely digital life. So how would that actually affect the future? And is there any model that you might want, or anybody want to talk a little bit about?
That's one development program we're doing right now. Since January this year, we've done already as a trial in Bali, and also in Bangkok, which is, the name is called Public-Private Partnership by Youth. So,
By youth.
So,
What's their role? What's their role?
The young people roles. So the design principle that we do is social issues we're going to tackle, the social issues we look at is demanded by or driven by local context. That means we are not, as a foreigner, say, okay, Bangkok, we need to address the food issues, but the Thai people tell us we need to address the food issues, and then they propose to us, let's talk about food safety, food, and the technology as the future. And then how young entrepreneurs as in the private sector, and also how we can dig out or map out the young public policy makers to work with us as the first agenda, and then how later on we crowd in more senior officials in the local Thai governments, and also more other private resources who are relatively senior in maybe family businesses and so on to come in. So the whole driving forces is coming from the very local context, and then the young generation first. That represents the energy that we really want to take proactive engagement in social issues to do it first. And then we design the whole very comprehensive agenda. Because this is very bottom up, so the agenda is very detailed and very action driven. Step A, what we're going to do as a program, what particular topics we're going to talk about. Second is what particular cases in Bangkok we're going to bring in. And third is, out of this context, what we're going to do next. For example, we form a food business network. We first designed a roundtable. That is, the agenda is set by the young entrepreneurs and also young policymakers from National Innovation Agency in Thailand. And then we put particular serval points what we're going to do with that. Are we going to set up a small impact fund with our local Thai friends who have resources? And then what is the perspective from, let's say, Hong Kong, how we add on the techniques or the professional knowledge that Hong Kong can add on. And then that as a whole agenda, how we form a network and sign the consortium MOU in Thailand, and we did that.
How are project delivered? Because I obviously agree that we need to bring in young entrepreneur and young social entrepreneur and have the mind to actually drive it. I coach quite a few in the university. But at the same time, they're not very fluent in the financing model of how things work.
Yes.
So obviously, and the complex contract that people need to work on. Obviously, we need to bring in all the different professionals to actually do it. But how would you see that model kind of?
I think first of all, in Southeast Asian context, things can be simpler than developed economy like the UK and the US. So there are lots of techniques that young generations can handle right now. And back to your question, sorry.
How does it work out?
How does it work out as in delivery?
Is there a project that you can name?
Yes, so a more completed one we have done right now is in Bali. So in January this year, we focused on future of tourism and hospitality industry in Bali, because the background of the issue is the economy in Bali, the tourism economy in Bali is so dominated by traditional hotel business, traditional tourism business, that resorts, which is very damaging the environment on the one hand, and on the other hand is the local employment is not really benefiting. Yes, there are a lot of Chinese tourists, a lot of foreign tourists from Australia and so on, but then the economy is altered in a way that the people, the tourists, only go to the shop that is owned by Chinese and Australians. The local banias are not benefiting at all. They're not in the managerial classes, but they are in the billboards or whatsoever. So, and the young people don't want to go to take out a job. For example, we want to try to hire 2 full-time staff in Bali. No one applied the job. We don't even disclose the salary yet, and no one applied because they only want to work in hotel, because they think that's the only way to do in future. So the issue is so focused, but at the same time so complex that take generations to handle. So we first do the program to understand the issue through working with a lot of local stakeholders, university students, professors, incubators, and mayor office. And through summits, through case studies, we have a first-hand and preliminary understanding of the issues. And And then the next step definitely is not yet jump to action or delivery, but we start structuring how young people can be doing in a more systematic way, which is
Usually who pay for these projects?
come again.
Usually who pays for these projects?
Very from the private sector.
Would the resort be willing to pay?
No, so the interesting thing is from a very much our organization perspective, the first 2 years when we do it, we only build trust. We spent 2 years in Southeast Asia. So the first 2 years we do a lot of programs and summits to build a trust. So that is very much self-financed. And first, of course, is from my pocket. The second is from our partners' pockets. Government is not involved, but we build relations. I mean, they don't provide fundings, but we involve them. After the trust is done, then the local private sector start providing resources. Say, hey, Andre, actually, it works, and I want to start putting money here. And those are people under 30 years old.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Anything? Anybody want to? Yeah.
I guess just on the role of young people within some of these things, it's a really specific example that in one of the social impact bonds I worked in the UK, it worked with people leaving care, so they've been taken into care by the state and then looked after for 10, 15, 20 years. And when you leave care in the United Kingdom, you get to 18 and you get typically, and this is changing now, but historically, you got given a house and you just and then you were left alone. Yeah. And a lot of young people ended up becoming homeless or not or drifting because they couldn't make the transition. So we ran a social impact bond helping young people to make the transition. And one of the outcomes in that, most of the outcomes were defined by government, but one of the outcomes we said, actually, why don't we get the young person to define what success looks like for them? And I don't think we realized at the time, but actually that was a really powerful thing to do. And it was the provider that we worked with who said, let's do this because this is really interesting. And obviously government said, I'm not sure, how will I get value for money? Does this make sense? And actually it's been a really great thing because you're empowering the young person to take control of the service they're receiving. So if they say, well, success to me looks like going to 3 job interviews, or it looks like something completely different, playing a bunch of sport, it's part of that journey. And obviously most of the payments are still for getting them into work and helping them sustain housing. But it's a small tweak to engage them really effectively and show that the service is listening to their preferences.
It's very interesting because this model, when we bring up, because using the bond, I don't know how they structure it, at least some of the pay can pay in the sense, or the measurement can actually change over time. Yep. Because it's, we were talking earlier about this new Nobel Prize, which is not really new in the sense of when you measure things, you actually measure, and the measurement helps you change. Instead of doing a 5-year, 10-year project and projecting 30 years of electricity return in 10%, nobody really knows. But if we are able to actually tune it over time, over a certain matrix that's measured, and bring design thinking in, you listen to the user.
Yes.
So that at least you know what's really going on. Most government people don't know what's going on in the field. So after you listen to them, then that becomes a benchmark. Yeah. And then you start building. And when you bring the entrepreneurial thing into it, that's you're building a minimum viable product to actually drive that direction. And I would think, especially for private equity or impact investment, that's something that really bring to the table, because for government people to actually say, I might actually need to change it over time, it's so complicated because it's legislation. But for an investor to change, well, we work fail, so SoftBank need to come in to save it. So no rules apply. There's only one way to do it, to save your $10 billion investment for SoftBank. So that's something that an investor, who is all, by definition also an entrepreneur, will actually come in to actually help do the process. So that balance is actually very important. Obviously, how you structure the bond is something everybody's actually trying to learn. But I would argue that, let's say, even when we do a mortgage, some of those will be able to change over time according to the P rate and different things and so on. So I think all those can be measurable and bring that in. And also, we are a little bit to Andre's point. One city come to mind, Seoul in Korea, because Mayor Park, who was there for 6 years now, 7 years, used to be a social entrepreneur. So the democratic system actually elect a person who is a social entrepreneur who is not completely left and not completely right. So he runs a 1,000 1,000 shops doing recycle of clothes. So basically he knows how it runs. It's not easy to run. Salvation Army tried to run it, but it's very difficult, but he runs it as a successful business. But then he bring that know-how into the system, into the policy system. And that's very, very interesting in the sense of these people have mission to actually go into actually drive it. And one of the most important things they drive is they build that data model to actually drive legislation and also force people to actually release numbers. So they drive it as a sharing city. So by driving that, many new jobs can actually comes in, and then a lot of small social enterprises can actually proliferate because more data are available, allow you to actually create something much cheaper, and you can fulfill the gaps and so on. So all these are new models that we see potentially driving it. Any thoughts on this particular point where how do we involve the youth in the matter, or any questions related to that? The next one I'll come back to Hong Kong a little bit more, but any questions related to the things that we talk about? It's very complex, frankly. There's no rule, nobody has been says, yeah, please. A little bit about yourself. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Krista Garvey. It seems to me that there's a whole army of youth who are more than capable of, taking society where it needs to go. I guess my question is how best to galvanize them and, how do I say, inspire them to understand that the future they're looking at, I'm afraid that they often look at the benchmark from the past 100 years. And if you go to the B Corp sessions or any other sessions, they're the first ones to tell you that was last century, this is the new century. Basically, everything that's about to change and happen is new, has never been tried. There is no template. It is a blank slate for these kids who I think have an enormous number of ideas, potential. They see things the way, we don't have to teach them to see things this way, like I think the current generation maybe does. So I guess my question is, how do you think is the best way to galvanize this population and make sure that they are looking at the future as a blank slate and not looking back at the way things have always been done in terms of how they see their opportunities? Because I think they will find them themselves.
Yeah, no, that is a great point. And in my experience, I often find the key to empowering youth is getting the adults out of the way. And I worked at the Gates Foundation for 10 years and did a lot of work in higher education. And we were particularly interested in improving student advising so that they saw more possibility, particularly with low-income students. They often see the employment opportunities that are in their communities, which are incredibly limited, and they don't understand what's out there. And so how do you create the career exploration mechanisms and the appropriate supports to guide them through to a better future? And we use technology, mostly because Bill is our leader, and because it can be really effective. But what we found is that as the administrators were developing the technology tools, they're not tech savvy, they're not digital natives, they don't understand the visual stimuli that attracts youth, so that they had these systems that were really text heavy, that were so boring that even I was falling asleep trying to read them and review them. And so I brought in, to your point about design thinking, some folks from the design school at Stanford to force the college administrators to share their ideas, their designs for the student support system with students as the focus group. And it just blew up their minds happily, in the sense that they realized that nothing they had designed really worked for the students, that their way of thinking about what students need was so dated, that they brought students onto the advisory group within the colleges to help drive the design and development of the systems. And so getting the adults out of the way, getting the students participating actively in the design of systems and services that are going to benefit them, I think is one of the best ways to get us from where we are now which doesn't address your question about the future, which I think is a really important one, which is how do you create the unfettered space without history that gives people the creativity and the stimulus to do that. And I think we're still working on that.
To react to this point, it's actually very interesting. Our semester is basically whole off, so this is our last week. But nobody was seeing anybody physically, so we are all online. But I'm preparing the next semester. A little bit about my background. I'm now in the University of Science and Technology, one of the leading universities in Hong Kong. We're looking at the whole process 5 years before. And then we looking at the whole process where some people might actually be focusing on, I only want to be a doctor because my grades are good. But if you are entering, and all the top students in Hong Kong trying to get into the medical field, but when they get out in 10 years, whatever they learn in the last 10 years will not work, because in 5 years, 10 years, it will be nano robots doing neurosurgeries. In 3 years, we start seeing big data that prevent disease before it actually happens. All these are things that's new, but there are no degrees and there are no institutes or systems that actually implement that. There's no professor that actually knows how to do this. So how do we actually teach? The whole point is we don't teach, get these people, old people, out of the way, but we want to create an environment to learn, because this is a new learning society. Anything can be learned online. Anything from how to handle tear gas to how to elevate the poor. Well, we lead the world in how to do that. Now we become the model cases. But basically, what we can, it's not being taught in chemistry class. So how do we do it? The way that we see it, at least in our university, it's we break down the large majors. So there are a lot more electives, even in engineering and even in medicals. So that even when you're studying medical, you start learning big data or AI, which actually in the long run, now it's not there yet, but it's smaller pieces actually help. And I think the key part is actually how you inspire them. Inspire them, I think it's not with KPIs, it's all about stories. It's about sharing how these stories actually work, because that touches the heart instead of the left or the right brain. And I think that's important, and then that's how you tell them not to go and die, because they are more important to save. So you need to bring that back into the system to actually do it. And I think most universities, especially the top ones, forget about this, because they only focus on the average salary for the first year that they come out, and whatever top degree that they actually do. So the way that we see it is, can we break down things more experience, that when you're studying, go to Cambodia, go out and help people, go to Central Pole to actually learn what's really going on. You'll be very unhappy, but do something about it. And then I think that's all those are, and learn the new process, use the new fintech, use blockchain to do it, use the new model to actually do it. But all those are not obviously not in the government system, and not even in our newer innovation courses. But if our courses are small enough, likely it can be online, that you can actually pick up all these things and actually learn from it. So I think getting back to the learning objects, and also there's a book from Stanford. It's called Designing Your Life, which is actually in our common core. It's about design thinking, but it's not about just design thinking to actually do a thing. It's about designing your own life. Meaning you need to have empathy of yourself and other people. And then you need to pick up and solve different problems. And those are things. That's very, very interesting point there. Okay, anybody who wants to react to that? It's a very important point. How do we engage? How do we inspire?
Regarding young people and learning and how to harness our forces in the future, I think one very interesting story to share is I just finished my first semester in the Economics School of Public Policy. So our school, 70% of our students, of our classmates are fully funded by scholarship. So that means basically we are all high achievers. We have our own initiatives before. We have our own projects and work before. And then we also did our work the best in our discipline. But then back in the policy school, we are in Singapore. So our school and the dormitory is basically a 5-minute walk. And the school workload basically is just so much that you're not allowed to leave your dormitory. So you basically have to skip classes to some sense. My semester is finished, so I can come here. Basically, I talked to at least 10 plus students, and none of them visited the downtown before in Singapore. So they've been basing in Singapore for 4 months, but none of them has the time to visit the downtown, or none of them has the mood to go to downtown. What we feel very sad and upset is we were high achiever, and then we were so-called the well-educated ones, but turn out the well-education bind us in the school again, that we are not allowed to understand further what's happening on the ground. We have so much, and that's how we start realizing what really divided the education and entrepreneurship. Why entrepreneurs don't want to go back to school. I am an entrepreneur, and I really realized why I skipped classes back in education, and now I got the privilege back to the school again. Now I feel so stressed again because of the lots of schoolwork. So I think entrepreneurs have our own world, creating a lot of solutions and thinking for issues in the world. But at the same time, again, the topic PPP, the public sector has been very stagnant. The movement that we are not really innovatively training public policy new wave leaders. The young policy students are still in the past, learning what has been done in the past, the thinking tools in the past. There's a huge linkage, the breakage between the connectivity. The policy students don't even understand young entrepreneurs. Even we are at the same age, we don't understand each other. So regarding your questions, I think there has to be more communication between entrepreneurs and young policy leaders. Otherwise, the same thing like what happened nowadays will happen again in 10 years. That the policy graduate still don't understand what is fintech, still don't understand what is blockchain. On the academic paper, they understand it. They write the same policy for the new technology, but the new entrepreneurs like, I don't want to care too much about policy. I don't want to care too much about government. That's why the current issue of PPP is still the big thing for the seniors and the government, but not the thing for young entrepreneurs. They feel I would rather do my own thing instead of going to sandbox, instead of going to infrastructure, because that's too bureaucratic. The time I can get a contract, the time I can involve the deal, I'm already old enough to join UN and do something. So that's
even worse usually.
I'm not sure if Dr. Lam is still here from UNDP. That's my experience. I was volunteering in UNDP for a time, and I'm the youngest one. I'm always the youngest one in different occasions, and what I've been witnessing is something very upsetting me. That there's a huge miscommunication, misunderstanding between the entrepreneur, the private sector, and the public sector. And the PPP is basically very much a high-level agenda, keep driving. Of course, it's a huge market, $1 trillion market, because it's high-level enough to cover the whole country. But then, if you look into so much detail, the young people will feel like, oh, this is a development agency. This is funding a lot of things. But then, the young entrepreneurs can't even handle the local social issues. They're still struggling. The social issue in the second tier, third tier cities, and the metrics and all the resources and the policies in the high level don't apply in the second tier cities. So there's a huge.
That's the danger. I think in a way you bring up something very interesting, where in normal industries, banking, real estate, taxi, hotel, they are all disrupted because they don't see it coming. And they are disrupted because the technology comes in. They will think, oh, pay a little bit and try it out. I'm sure Marriott have done Airbnb somehow in one of their departments. And then obviously they ignore it because it's done by young people who would rent a bed. And then obviously now Airbnb is bigger than Marriott. So I'm saying the government's doing the same thing. But the way that people disrupt them can be very, very disruptive. And that's scary. So I think that I agree. I think that's world is changing. I need to summarize. The world is changing, but we need to find a way to better communicate. And a lot of these tools are there. I agree. This is the way to save the world, because entrepreneurial, if it's not just focusing on profit and focusing on social and people's need, is actually the it's not the left and the right. It's not the social states. it's not just a big government or small government, it's actually doing both, or let the people drive a little bit more. But how do you drive that? It's frankly, there's no political model that actually works. And then there are no education system that actually works yet. But I think at least the funding and the whole process is actually driving it, and hopefully build some ecosystem. Because ecosystem is like that. It's stable system, disrupt, and then somehow it's stabilized to a certain point. And new rules comes out, and then we need to actually be able to drive it. When we think about all these new rules, potentially I think that's what's important, is how do we drive and inspire the next generation? Who's the most learned generation ever? Digital natives, and they will drive the future. How do we drive it? And with these ecosystems needs to come in to actually drive that. And then obviously we learn from the US model, very interesting building ecosystem to actually driving how the UK and European model is actually working, and so on. So thank you very much for coming. I think it's a very useful and very difficult panel for me, but it's very, very interesting to actually share. So let's give all of them very good. There's we have the souvenir thing, so let's give out the souvenir. But it's first thing, it's social enterprise. Second, it's also good. At least you're in Hong Kong, so I'll give you. or it's somebody from SEC going to do. Okay, I'll represent. Okay, thank you. Okay, so give a chance to Gary. Come, thank you. Come to the front. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, my eyes up?
Yeah, sure. Shot. Okay, here. Just make 1, 2, 3. Shot. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's right.
Sorry.
Change, a lot of change. It is. I mean, in a way, I'm an angel investor in this sort of With all CEO, younger CEOs, the old guys to help the network and
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. I need that.
That's fun.
Yeah, that was good. Are you going to facilitate Saturday?
Yes, actually, how can we bring this to the newer generation? We're actually launching entrepreneurial education for primary school.
Oh, wow.
It's a major project. We have launched it, and then